Hello gang, we are in Nashville, Tennessee, and we are approaching a cemetery here on the left called Hermitage. And guess who's buried here? Well, pretty famous guy, a guy that I met in college actually, and we're going to talk about it and visit his grave. We're in. All right, we are going to be walking to the grave of a man named Rudolf Walter Wanderone Jr. You don't recognize that name? Well, you might know him as Minnesota Fats, the famous pool player. And he has quite a story. I got to tell you, when I was at college, I was at SIU University in Carbondale, Illinois, and I think I was a freshman. With my buddies, we were at the student center, you know, the pool hall, bowling alley, all the stuff. And we saw this fat guy was given a little clinic. And we're like, oh, that's Minnesota Fats. We went over, and as it turned out, it was him. And boy, I'll never forget that guy. He was yapping away, and he had us rolling, we were laughing our butts off. But I have some really good memories. You know, it was just a lucky time in my life. I happened to be at the right place at the right time. So let's go take a walk to Rudolph's grave, Minnesota Fats, and I'll tell you his story here. All cemeteries are different, aren't they? This one, well, we don't have any. There's no markers other than ground markers, and what's unusual that I find here is almost every single grave has a new bouquet of flowers. I mean, I've seen, you see flowers at the graves, but these aren't new graves. I was looking at some of the dates. But let's talk about Minnesota Fats. He was born in New York City, January 19th, 1913. His parents were immigrants from Switzerland. He was known as Rudy, that was his nickname, of course, Rudolph. And he started playing pool. They were living in Manhattan. He was just a kid, he was playing pool. And in 1923, he traveled with his father to Europe. And that's where things really started to turn and really got him into the pool game, where he had received this training, special training from one of the German greats. And they played the game called bulk line billiards, and he got his training from Erich Hagenlacher. Now, after he got that training and he started getting really, really good, he had his first prominent match. It was in 1926, and he was competing against a 9-ball player, a guy named Cowboy Weston. And Rudolph kicked his butt. So he left school, and he started doing that full time. And this is where he started getting his nickname as Smarts, or Smart Henry. I think he said in an interview, and there are several interviews you can see, oh, what a colorful personality he has. But I think he called himself, he was not bashful. He's kind of like, how Muhammad Ali would talk about himself, and it's just that personality, it's a show personality. And he would say, yeah, they called me Smarts. I was the smartest guy on earth. And called me Smarts 1, Smarts 2, Smarts 3. He had all these nicknames, but he didn't have Minnesota Fats. He was portly, but that would come later. He had, some of the nicknames were, I said, like Smart 3 is really triple smart. But then as he gained weight, and you can look at some of the old pictures even when he was young, he got that nickname New York Fats. Now they called him New York Fats, Broadway Fats, and Chicago Fats. Fats, Fats, Fats. And he was like a magnet. He was a magnet to people. He started to put on the show. Of course, it was unusual. You could walk in and pick them right out. And he was a magnet for hustlers. And one of those hustlers was named Luther Wimpy Lassiter. And a little story on Wimpy, his nickname. So he was a real, these hustlers, they were pool sharks. And Lassiter was playing this guy, and they were on this, I think his name was Murphy. They were on this long run of balls, and Wimpy was sitting on the chair, and he's pretended he fell asleep. And the guy was I guess he missed a shot, or he missed a shot on purpose, whatever. There was some strategy, oh, he's asleep, I can run these balls in. And he wasn't asleep, he was hustling them. And when he saw he missed the shot or stopped, did something wrong, cheating maybe, and he snapped right out of his chair, and he's like, my turn. And he ran the table. I mean, that's what these guys would do. They'd have an angle, and they were hustlers. So in 1941, Rudolph and his friend Jimmy Castris arrived. They actually arrived to southern Illinois, which is by no coincidence where I went to college. Some of his stomping grounds there. And they played in a televised tournament. And they settled in a little town called DuQuoin. DuQuoin is just north of SIU Carbondale. And that was kind of little grounds, little hustling grounds there that he had. And that's where he met his future wife, Evelyn Inez Graff. And by the way, there's a YouTube on Evelyn Inez giving an interview. I think she's still alive, telling a lot of his crazy stories. It's a pretty good, interview. Very informal. Well, they got married, and then they ended up settling in the area in a town called Dowell, Illinois. In 1942, they moved to Norfolk, Virginia, which was the mustering ground, for American soldiers, shipbuilding center. And it was a hotbed for gambling and hustling, well, for him. So it had some great opportunities. So he partnered back up with Wimpy Lassiter, and they were doing pretty good. But once the war was over, the action dried up. So they returned back to the DuQuoin area. They call that Little Egypt, near Carbondale. And in the 1950s, he was basically in semi-retirement. He'd make his hustling trips to New York City. He would do events, but then some new opportunities would develop. And I'm going to focus on two of them. Two of them, of course, the movie, The Hustler, with Paul Newman and Jackie Gleason, who really brought the name Minnesota Fats into the light. And this is really, I'm going to tell you the story how Rudolph really kind of took that name as Minnesota instead of Chicago or New York Fats. And it's an interesting story. Basically, what happened was of course, the movie came out, it was a big hit, and it was said that, oh yeah, it's, they modeled it after him. I mean, he was known all over the country. But then he went and the newspapers got the word, and they took off with that. And the newspapers were like, yeah, that's Minnesota Fats. So there was a conflict between him and the movie makers. The movie makers were like, no, we didn't get that from him. And then the movie makers, he got in a lawsuit. I think he sued them. But at the end of the day, they all lost. And they had to, it was a kind of a silent payoff that they had to give him. They kind of acquiesced. So very interesting. He, from then on, was known as Minnesota Fats. Now, his greatest rivalry would be Willie Mosconi. And if you know, Willie Mosconi was probably one of the greatest pool players that ever lived. And whenever you would watch him, and it's been said that he would make the game look boring. I mean, he was not a showman, but boring because it was all about, pool is all about the setup. You make a shot, but it's all about, you make yourself easy shots. So he played this boring game because it was like a chess player. He had all the shots lined up in his head. He just go boom, 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 and run the table. But those two guys would have unbelievable rivalry. Mosconi could not stand Minnesota Fats because Mosconi was a gentleman. And Mosconi couldn't stand Minnesota Fats bantering and blabbing. I mean, that was part of his shtick. That was part of his act. Mosconi would wear, I kid you not, he would wear earplugs. And Fats would just, and he knew he would get on his nerves. Mosconi beat him a lot. But then there was a tournament, I think it was the Wide World of Sports, where I think it was at Resorts International, it was a shootout. And that was that was Minnesota Fats' his last big appearance. And he actually, after a trick shot tournament, he doubled up with somebody and they played a duel match. And Fats beat him. Oh, did that burn Mosconi up. But anyway, he had said in an interview when he was asked about his strategy to beat him, he said he thought to himself, I'll make the 7-ball on the break and I'll end it. Then I'll help carry Willie out on a stretcher. That was so Minnesota Fats. He was always cocky. He had that shtick. In 1984, he left his wife, Evelyn, and a year later they divorced. He moved to the Hermitage Hotel here in Nashville. And in 1985, he was here for several years. 92, he had undergone a surgery for knee surgery, and sadly, he had a massive heart attack. But he survived, but not long. In 93, he had met his second wife, Teresa Talley Bell. He was making his way back, but in her Nashville house here, he died on January 15th, 1996. He was 4 days shy of his 83rd birthday. Very sad. But he lived a full life. And man, Minnesota Fats, what a legend. Well, his grave is right around here. Here we go. Right here. Rudolf W. Wanderone, Minnesota Fats, and there's his picture. There's his picture. Let's take a close look at that relief in the bronze. There he is. For eternity, and on the other side we have 2 pool cues and the rack. And speaking of the rack, the epitaph I think is pretty interesting and comical. Beat every living creature on earth. St. Peter, rack 'em up, Fats. That's so classic. That is so classic. Well, it seems like a very lonely place here. No flowers, not sure if he's getting any visitors, but I'll tell you this, the 1984, the Billiards Congress of America inducted him into its Hall of Fame, so well before he passed away, he was recognized for his contributions for helping popularize the game of pool. His Hall of Fame was noted as meritorious service. Rudolf was a lover of animals and reported to have dozens of cats and dogs running around his place. He had devoted a lot of time to finding home for stray animals. He would say, "I'm crazy about every living creature." But like I said, he was most well known for his banter, those puns, those funny phrases during the matches. There really were performances, but he was good. And I think that's why people loved him, just the personality that he had. And he would go anywhere to help promote the game. He was a real crowd pleaser. And I can tell you this firsthand. As I stood there with those small group of guys, my friends at the Student Center pool hall, I remember, I can picture his face in my mind's eye. I remember he had that wry smile and that twinkle in his eye. So I have really good memories of Rudolf W. Wanderone. Rest in peace, sir.